A single dad CEO's car breaks down on a mountain road. A forest girl helps, and the mountain road twisted through shadowed woods, slick with rain, the headlights of the black SUV barely cutting through the downpour. Wind clawed at the trees, howling like wolves across the ridge. Kevin Stone gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles pale beneath the dashlights. In the back seat, his 7-year-old daughter Ellie lay curled under a blanket, her face flushed with fever, her breath shallow. "Almost there, sweetheart," he murmured, though they both knew that was a lie. A sudden jolt rocked the vehicle. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The SUV rolled to a stop on the narrow shoulder, surrounded by endless trees and thick fog. Kevin tried the ignition. Once, twice, nothing. He looked down at his phone. No signal. "Great," he muttered, running a hand through his rain-damp hair. Outside, the storm grew louder, more violent. He opened the door, stepped out, and was instantly soaked to the bone. "Stay inside, Ellie," he called over his shoulder. "I'll see if I can flag someone down." But the road was empty. There were no cars, no cabins, just trees and rain and the growing panic in his chest. "Daddy?" came a small voice. He turned. Ellie was leaning out the door, her eyes heavy, skin too pale. "I'm cold." He rushed back, pulled the blanket tighter around her. Her forehead burned against his palm. She was burning up. "We need help," he said aloud to no one. Then, through the sheet of rain, a light appeared. A flicker, then a steady glow. Flashlight. A figure emerged from the woods, a woman in a hooded poncho, carrying a bundle under her arm and a lantern in her free hand. She moved with purpose, boots sloshing in the mud, her eyes sharp beneath the shadow of her hood. "If you stay out here any longer, the girl's going to get much worse," she said, her voice calm, direct. Kevin stood, shielding Ellie instinctively. "Who are you?" "The only person within 5 miles who's willing to help you survive the night," she replied. He hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger, but Ellie let out a soft moan and the woman stepped closer. "I have a dry place, warmth, water. You can't stay here." Kevin nodded reluctantly, lifting Ellie in his arms. The woman turned and led them into the woods. The path was narrow, winding through pine and cedar, slick with roots and wet leaves. Kevin followed her closely, cradling Ellie to his chest, her tiny arms around his neck. She barely stirred. After about 15 minutes, a soft light appeared ahead. A wooden cabin stood nestled among the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. The woman opened the door and waved them in. "Lay her on the cot by the stove," she instructed, already moving to light more oil lamps. Kevin obeyed, setting Ellie down gently. The warmth inside hit him immediately, the scent of burning wood, herbs, and something sweet. The woman removed her poncho and hung it near the fire. Her hair was long, slightly tangled, her clothes simple but clean. She knelt by Ellie and pulled a soft wool blanket over her. "Fever's high," she murmured. "Do you have any medicine?" Kevin shook his head. "No, I was just trying to get her somewhere peaceful." She moved to a shelf and returned with a small jar. "Elderflower and ginger tea. It will help bring the fever down." He stepped in between. "Wait, what is that?" "It's safe, natural. I've used it for years." "You're not a doctor," she met his gaze, "and you're not going to find one up here tonight." He hesitated, then stepped back. She sat beside Ellie, coaxing her to sip from a cup. Ellie stirred, swallowed, and sighed. Her eyelids fluttered shut again. Kevin watched in silence. The woman stood and turned to him. "You're lucky I heard your engine die." "You live out here?" he asked. "Full time," she replied, placing the empty cup in a basin. "Name's Mira." He extended his hand. Kevin Stone." Mira glanced at his outstretched hand but did not take it. "Wash up, dry off. Your daughter needs you strong." He looked down at himself, mud to the knees, soaked through. In the corner, Mira had laid out a towel and a dry blanket. He moved toward them slowly, glancing back at Ellie. Mira followed his gaze. "She's safe, for now." He sat heavily in the worn armchair, rubbing his temples. "I was trying to give her a break. She's been anxious. City life is noisy." Mira knelt to stir the fire. "This place is quiet. too quiet," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what you hear when you finally stop running." And he looked up, met her eyes. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, unspoken but solid. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a fragile sense of shelter had begun to form. The morning light filtered through wooden slats and soft linen curtains, casting golden lines across the small cabin. Kevin stirred in the armchair, his neck aching from the awkward sleep. He blinked, unsure for a moment where he was, until the scent of cedar, herbs, and burning wood reminded him. He sat up quickly. "Ellie?" "She's here," Mira's voice came from the far side of the cabin. "Still sleeping." Kevin turned. His daughter lay on the cot near the fireplace, her cheeks less flushed, her breath deeper, steadier. A cool cloth rested on her forehead. Mira was crouched beside the wood-burning stove, stirring something in a clay pot. Her long hair was tied back now, and she moved with the ease of someone who knew every inch of the space she lived in. "Her fever broke a little after midnight," she said without looking at him. "That tea helped. She sweated out most of it." "What was in it?" Kevin asked. "Elderflower, ginger, wild mint, willow bark," he frowned. "That's not real medicine." Mira finally turned to him, unblinking. "It's real enough to help her sleep through the night." Kevin stood. "Look, I appreciate the shelter, but I need to get her to a real clinic. She should be seen by a doctor, blood work, IV fluids, not forest soup." Mira stood too, placing the ladle down slowly. "Do you see a road outside, a signal tower, ambulance lights?" Kevin looked away. "She's stable," Mira continued. "Better than when you carried her in, soaked and shaking. So maybe trust that she's not in danger right now." Kevin paced, his voice rising. "You don't get it. I've spent her entire life trying to protect her. Schedules, safety nets. I cannot afford to mess this up, not even once." Mira walked past him, opened a wooden cupboard, and pulled out 2 handmade bowls. "Do you want to stay angry, or do you want breakfast?" "I want control," he muttered. Mira turned sharply. "Then you should have stayed in your city, with your asphalt and blueprints." He froze. She continued, calmer now. "You design cities, right? Places where people can live. I preserve the wild, so people can remember how to feel." Kevin narrowed his eyes. "I don't need a lecture." Mira's expression didn't change. "Neither do I." They stood in silence, 2 worlds colliding in the stillness of a forest morning. Finally, Mira walked back to the stove and began to ladle porridge into the bowls. "I built this cabin with my own hands," she said. "Everything I eat, I grow or trade. I do not need electricity to be alive, and I do not need permission to trust the earth." Kevin looked down at the thick beams of wood, the handmade furniture, the shelves full of dried herbs and hand-carved tools. "You live like this?" "By choice," Mira smiled. "Yes, not to escape the world, but to live in the part of it that still breathes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're not afraid out here? Of wolves or weather, no. But I'm often afraid of people." That surprised him. "Why?" "Because they see something different and want to change it." He sat down slowly, not far from Ellie. Her little chest rose and fell peacefully. "I wasn't always a forest person," Mira admitted, handing him a bowl. "I lived in the city once. I know what it's like to rush, to plan, to worry. That's why I left." Kevin took the bowl but did not eat. "What made you stay?" She looked at him, really looked. "One day, I realized I could hear myself think again." They both turned as Ellie stirred on the cot. Mira walked over and knelt beside her, checking the cloth on her forehead. "She'll be up soon. Maybe hungry, the fever's going down." Kevin knelt opposite her, watching his daughter sleep. "I'm sorry I snapped," he said quietly. "I'm not used to this." Mira looked at him softly. "I know." He glanced around the cabin again. "No Wi-Fi, no phone, no backup plan. It's like you live on trust." "Exactly," she whispered. "And you? You're a man who builds cities that touch the sky, but your feet never touch the ground anymore." Kevin looked down at his shoes, still caked in yesterday's mud. "You may be right," he said. She stood and handed him a clean towel. "Then maybe while you're here, take your shoes off." He gave a reluctant half-smile. The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabin, something more profound was beginning to stir. A shifting of ground, a loosening of walls, a quiet question neither dared to ask yet. What if this pause was not just a detour, but the beginning of a different way to live? By the third day, Kevin had given up on finding a signal. No bars, no rescue trucks, nothing but wind in the trees and the occasional chatter of birds that seemed completely uninterested in his urban urgency. Ellie, on the other hand, had adjusted far too quickly. She was now barefoot more often than not, her once pristine pink sneakers resting untouched near the door. Mira had made her a small satchel out of cloth scraps, and Ellie filled it daily with rocks, leaves, feathers, and anything else she could name or imagine a story around. Kevin watched from the porch as Ellie crouched near a mossy log, Mira beside her, showing her how to spot wild mushrooms and draw patterns in the dirt. She does not even miss the iPad, Kevin muttered to himself. He spent his mornings pacing, trying again and again to reach his assistant, his office, his inbox. Even with Mira's radio, there was no way to call down the mountain. Every failed attempt left him more frustrated, more off balance. The only working thing here was time, and it was not on a schedule. That afternoon, as gray clouds passed overhead, Kevin returned from checking the road, still blocked, still hopeless. He stepped into the cabin to find muddy footprints trailing across the wooden floor, and then came the shriek. "Ellie!" he called. She popped her head in from the kitchen, cheeks flushed, hands smeared with soil. "Yes, Daddy?" "What happened to you?" he said sharply. "You're covered in dirt." "I was helping Mira plant lavender near the stream," she beamed. "She said I have gardener's hands." Kevin's voice rose. "This is not a playground, Ellie. You could have gotten sick or stepped on something sharp." Her face fell. Mira appeared behind her, calm as ever, a faint line of soil across one cheek. "She was fine, Kevin. She was with me." Kevin turned toward her, exasperated. "You should have told me. She's 7. What if something happened?" Mira folded her arms. "You built a city park with interactive sculptures and splash pads so children could play safely in the open. Yet you panic when your own daughter touches a patch of dirt? She's not a blueprint," he snapped. "She's my responsibility, and I respect that," Mira said, voice steady. "But maybe she needs more than protection. Maybe she needs connection." Kevin looked down, his jaw tight. "You think I do not care?" "No," Mira said gently. "I think you care so much that you've forgotten how to let go." He said nothing. She walked past him to fetch a towel and handed it to Ellie, who stood in awkward silence, watching them both. "Go clean up, little bird," Mira said softly. Ellie nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Kevin sighed and rubbed his temples. "I'm not trying to be the bad guy." "You're not," Mira said. "You're just a father who has spent too long trying to build a world that cannot break." Kevin sat down on the edge of the chair near the hearth. "I used to think the more I designed, the more I could control. Buildings, spaces, even emotions." Mira crouched beside the fire, adding another log. "And what happens when the world grows outside your designs?" He looked at her. "You let it grow," she whispered. The fire crackled between them. That night, Kevin stepped outside after Ellie had fallen asleep. The stars were brighter than he had seen in years. No light pollution, no traffic, just wind and crickets. Mira was already there, sitting on the old wooden swing she had tied between 2 trees. He joined her. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For letting my daughter touch the earth without asking permission." Mira smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "She reminded me of someone. A girl I used to be, before the noise." Kevin leaned back, gazing up. "You really never wanted to go back?" "I went back once," Mira admitted. "I lasted 3 days. I could not breathe with concrete beneath my feet." He nodded slowly. "And you?" she asked. "What would you design if no one told you what it had to be?" He thought for a long moment. "A place where Ellie could run barefoot through grass without anyone asking her to stop." Mira chuckled. "You might be closer to that than you think." In the silence that followed, something between them softened. The line between man and architect, forest and freedom, began to blur. And in that moment, surrounded by trees older than memory, Kevin wondered for the first time if he had finally found the foundation worth building on. Not with bricks, but with roots. The storm rolled in just after nightfall. Rain pounded the roof of the cabin like 1,000 tiny drums, and wind howled through the trees like a wild ancient choir. Inside, the fire flickered low, and the single bulb overhead sputtered, then went dark. Kevin stood near the window, staring at the black screen of his phone. No signal, he muttered. No power. Perfect. Mira calmly lit a candle, then another. She moved with quiet precision, placing them along the mantel, casting the cabin in a soft golden glow. "It happens," she said simply, as if the storm outside was just another passing guest. Ellie stirred on the cot, uneasy in her sleep. Mira walked over, knelt beside her, and gently pulled the blanket higher. The little girl whimpered, turning restlessly. Without hesitation, Mira lay beside her, curling her arm around Ellie's tiny body. She began to hum, low and soothing, a tune Kevin didn't recognize. Simple but tender, like a lullaby that belonged to the trees. Kevin watched, unmoving. His daughter calmed almost instantly, snuggling into Mira's embrace. Something tugged deep in his chest. He had never seen Ellie so safe, so still, not even with him. Mira didn't speak, didn't ask for thanks. She just held her, as if she had always been meant to. When Ellie finally drifted into steady sleep, Mira sat up and glanced at Kevin. "She's okay now," she whispered. He nodded, his throat tight. She walked over and handed him a candle. "There's more in the kitchen if we need them." He took it, their fingers brushing briefly. It was the lightest of touches, but it sparked something unnamed. They sat by the fire as the storm raged outside. The candlelight danced between them, painting shadows on the wooden walls. Kevin leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the flickering flames. "You're different," he said quietly. "Most people would have called the cops, or told me to go back down the mountain." Mira smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. "Most people aren't trying to outrun themselves." He looked at her, surprised. She returned his gaze, calm and clear. "You didn't bring your daughter up here just to escape noise. You brought her because something in you is tired of the noise." He exhaled. "I guess I thought if I could just build the perfect getaway, the stress would melt off. And it followed me anyway." She nodded knowingly. Kevin leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I spend my life designing spaces for others, parks, homes, plazas, places for people to gather, to feel alive. But sometimes," he paused, "sometimes I forget how to feel alive myself." Mira looked down at her hands. "I used to study art, watercolor, mixed media. I wanted to open a gallery, bright space, tall ceilings, music playing all day long." "What happened?" Kevin asked gently. "My mom died when I was 20. Cancer." Mira's voice was steady but soft. "She was the only person who ever really saw me. After she passed, I stopped painting. I dropped out, moved here. I thought if I surrounded myself with silence, I'd stop hurting." "Did it work?" he asked. She glanced toward the window where lightning briefly lit up the sky. "No, but eventually the forest gave me something else." "What's that?" "Presence. Pain didn't go away, but at least here, I could feel it without pretending I was okay." Kevin looked at her, really looked. In the gentle curve of her shoulders, in the quiet strength in her voice, he saw someone who had stopped running long before he ever started. "You're brave," he said. Mira raised an eyebrow. "For living without a dishwasher?" "For choosing stillness," he replied. Silence fell again, but it wasn't heavy. It was warm, honest. The candle between them burned low. Kevin turned to her. "I know how to create beautiful spaces, but I'm starting to wonder if I ever knew how to live in them." She didn't respond right away. Then she said, almost like an echo, "Maybe it's time you build something new." He looked at her. "Not a house," she added. "Not a park, not even a cabin." She placed a hand gently over her heart. "Maybe you need to start rebuilding here." The fire cracked softly between them. Kevin swallowed hard. "That's harder than drawing blueprints." Mira's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then maybe stop drawing and just start feeling." Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain slowing into a soft patter. Inside, two people who had spent most of their lives trying to control the world around them sat quietly, no longer trying to escape, but beginning, for the first time, to stay. The morning sun rose behind thick layers of drifting cloud, casting a muted golden haze across the mountaintops as Kevin guided the SUV down the winding road. The tires hummed steadily on the wet pavement, fixed, finally, but there was no comfort in the smoothness. The forest, lush and ancient, faded further with each turn. In the rearview mirror, the treetops seemed to sway one last goodbye, as if asking him, pleading with him, not to leave. Neither he nor Ellie said much during the drive. The silence wasn't tense, it was wistful. Ellie hugged her stuffed raccoon to her chest, the small, handmade toy Mira had sewn just the night before. Its crooked smile and mismatched button eyes gave it more personality than half the toys she had back in the city. She didn't look at Kevin. She didn't look at the road. She just stared out the window, eyes wide and too quiet for a 7-year-old. Her voice finally broke the stillness. "I wish we could stay longer." Kevin glanced at her, his chest tightening. "I know, baby. Me too." But Mira hadn't asked them to stay. She had embraced Ellie tightly, whispering something into her hair Kevin couldn't hear. Then she'd turned to him, resting her hand briefly on his arm, a silent, steady touch, and said only, "Be safe. The road is long, but some paths find their way back." And now, that road had led them to the bottom of the mountain and back to the city. Everything felt wrong. When Kevin opened the door to their high-rise apartment, the familiar chill of air conditioning swept over them. It used to feel like coming home. Now it felt sterile, over-sanitized, soulless. The gleam of polished floors, the sleek, sharp-edged furniture, the minimalist decor, all pristine, untouched, unlived in. Ellie didn't say a word. She slipped off her boots, leaving small wet prints across the hardwood as she disappeared into her room. Kevin didn't follow. He just stood in the center of the living space, his briefcase still in hand, staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the skyline he had once loved. The view used to inspire him. Now it made him feel like a stranger in someone else's life. Later that night, he tried to work. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up the resort blueprints. The familiar lines and angles filled the screen, perfectly measured, professionally rendered. Sleek towers, infinity pools, private cabanas, a luxury retreat that would rise right where Mira's cabin now stood. It was supposed to be his masterpiece. His name would be on everything. His firm would gain prestige, acclaim. But all Kevin saw was concrete cutting through roots, steel rising where wild lavender had once bloomed, a scar waiting to happen. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and pressed the power button. The screen went dark. He sat in the silence, staring at his reflection in the black mirror, and for the first time, he wasn't proud of what he'd built. The days that followed only deepened Kevin's sense of disconnection. Everything in the city felt sharper, colder, louder. He heard the screech of brakes and the endless hum of elevators with a new awareness, like someone who had lived in quiet and was now being shouted at. The walls of his apartment, once admired for their minimalist charm, now closed in around him like a sleek, polished box. Ellie had changed too. Once inseparable from her tablet and streaming shows, she now refused screens altogether. She spent her afternoons curled on the living room floor, sketching page after page of trees, mossy rocks, wildflowers, birds in flight. Mira's face appeared in soft pencil lines more than once, her braid, her boots, the way she knelt by the garden. Ellie slept each night clutching the stuffed raccoon Mira had made for her. In the mornings, her first words weren't about breakfast or school, they were questions about the garden, the smell of firewood, the lavender patch near the creek. Kevin tried to dive back into work, to force focus, but his creativity had vanished. The ideas came flat. Designs that once brought him excitement now felt like soulless geometry. He sat in meetings nodding on autopilot, making decisions he didn't believe in, his mind drifting to streams and stone paths, to Mira's quiet voice and Ellie's laughter echoing through pine trees. On the fourth evening, Kevin came home late and found Ellie on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket too big for her. Her sketchbook was open in her lap, pages fluttering in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of traffic and takeout from a nearby restaurant. "I don't like it here anymore," she said, eyes still on the skyline. "It smells like plastic. There are no crickets." Kevin sat beside her, the ache in his chest familiar now. "Do you miss Mira?" Ellie nodded slowly. "And the firewood, and the stars." And how quiet it felt. She paused, then added, "But not the lonely kind of quiet, the good kind." He followed her gaze to the shimmering lights of the city, a grid of ambition stretching endlessly outward. "You know," he said, voice soft, "I think I forgot how to breathe until I got there." Ellie turned to him, eyes wide and honest. "Then why are we here?" He had no answer. But that night, he stayed up long after Ellie went to bed, standing in the dark kitchen gripping a cold mug of tea. Something shifted inside him, not a whim, but a quiet clarity. The next morning, Kevin walked into the glass-paneled office of the resort development firm. He was greeted with handshakes, espresso, eager smiles. They gathered around a long conference table, waiting to hear about the project. Kevin opened the sleek black folder of blueprints, stared at the lines for a moment, and then closed it again. "I can't go forward with this project," he said. The room froze. "Excuse me?" one of the partners asked, leaning forward. "I'm withdrawing," Kevin repeated. "Effective immediately." "This is a multi-million-dollar contract, Kevin," another voice said. "What happened?" Kevin turned to the window. He saw reflections of suits, chrome, and high-rises, but his mind was filled with trees. "I went to the site," he said. "I met the land, and the people who live there. It's not just wilderness. It's not empty, it's full, and building over it would not be creation, it would be destruction." A beat of silence passed. "You'll be walking away from a lot." He nodded. "I'd rather lose a contract than lose myself." And with that, he picked up his folder and walked out of the boardroom, without looking back. Later that evening, as he and Ellie packed a few bags, she looked up at him and smiled. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Kevin zipped her bag shut and touched her hair gently. "We're going back to the place where we felt alive." She grinned, hugged her raccoon tighter, and whispered, "Back home." Kevin looked around the polished apartment one last time, and for the first time in years, walking away felt like coming home. The forest was no longer just a refuge, it was home. Weeks after returning, Kevin and Ellie settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply natural. He had traded his downtown high-riser for a small cabin not far from Mira's. It was modest, open to the trees, with wide windows and a roof he'd helped patch with his own hands. It did not echo with silence. It breathed. Ellie began attending the local village school. She came home each day with leaves in her backpack and stories of hiking lessons, seed sorting, and a girl named Juniper who knew how to talk to frogs. Her laughter was louder now, wilder, free. Kevin worked remotely most weekdays. His architecture firm had agreed to let him consult from afar. He designed nature centers, parks, and green campuses, projects he believed in. And on Fridays, when his laptop shut, he shed his city skin and returned fully to the woods. Mira had changed too. She had transformed the old barn behind her cabin into an open-air art studio. Children from neighboring villages came to draw with charcoal, mix berry pigments, and paint leaves with tiny fingers. She called it Nest and Fern, and when she laughed during class, it sounded like the wind through birch trees. They never talked about labels. Kevin never pushed. But everything about the way they lived said one thing clearly. They were a family, not by name, but by rhythm, by presence, by choice. Every Saturday morning they walked the village market together. Ellie ran ahead with a basket too big for her arms, eager to help Mira choose apples and herbs. Kevin carried bread and honey, nodded politely at vendors, and listened to the townsfolk call him The City Man Who Stayed. One such morning the square was especially full. A harvest fair. Musicians played on crates, children danced barefoot, and couples wove through stands of handmade scarves and stone jewelry. Kevin reached for Mira's hand out of instinct, then paused. But Mira didn't hesitate. She took his hand firmly and laced her fingers with his. It was not for balance or politeness. It was not to shield from a crowd. It was a declaration. People turned. Some nodded, some smiled. A few whispered. But Kevin only saw the curve of Mira's lips, the calm in her eyes. She had never been one for grand gestures. She built fences from habit and rarely let anyone too close. But today, in this open space, she held his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. He squeezed gently. "You sure?" Mira looked at him, her voice soft. "I'm not a leaf in the wind, Kevin. I choose where I grow, and I've chosen." Ellie ran up, mouth full of cinnamon bread. "Can we get pumpkin tea too?" Kevin laughed. "If you can carry the bag." Mira reached down and helped Ellie loop the strap over her shoulder. As the three of them walked back through the market, hands full, hearts light, Kevin realized something. He had spent most of his life designing for permanence, stone, steel, foundations that lasted. But this fragile, living bond between them, it was the most rooted thing he had ever known. No concrete could hold a family together, but love, grown slow and wild and honest, that could hold through anything. The forest held its breath. Under the towering tree where their paths first crossed, the same one that had once stood silent witness to a broken-down SUV and a woman holding a lantern in the storm, now hung wildflower garlands and ribbons made of linen. Wooden benches lined the natural clearing. The air smelled of pine, lavender, and a hint of wood smoke. It was not a wedding like in magazines. There were no velvet drapes or champagne towers, but there was laughter. There was music, played on fiddle and hand drum by village friends. There were smiles and hands held, and children dancing barefoot in the moss. Mira stood in a soft off-white dress, stitched by a neighbor and dyed with pressed flowers. Her hair was loosely braided with fern sprigs and forget-me-nots. She had never imagined herself as a bride. Not really. Not until now. Kevin stood opposite her, wearing a light linen shirt, sleeves rolled up, boots still muddy from the trail. His eyes never left hers. Ellie, in a light green dress, clutched a folded paper with both hands. Her voice was small but certain as she stepped forward between them. "Today," she said, "I want to say thank you. To Mira for being my roots, for teaching me to draw with mud and to listen to birds. And to Dad," she looked up at Kevin, her voice thickening with emotion. "Dad used to build big cities with lights and towers, but now he builds something even more important. He built a home in my heart." Kevin smiled, his throat tight. "I love you both, and I hope this tree keeps all our stories." Mira knelt and hugged her tight. "It already has, little wildflower." They stood hand in hand as the elder of the village, an old woman with clear eyes and a voice like river stone, blessed their union with words passed down generations. "Marriage," she said, "is not made of rings or promises spoken in grand halls. It is made in firewood stacked for another, in hands held when no one watches, in every silent choice to stay." Kevin turned to Mira, took her hands. "You once told me I should rebuild from within," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I didn't know then how. But you, Mira, you became my blueprint, my compass." Mira's eyes shimmered. "I used to think I was just roots," she whispered, "stuck, grounded, afraid of the sky. But with you I found something more." She glanced at Ellie, then back to Kevin, voice steady. "I found wings." Cheers broke out as the elder declared them husband and wife. They kissed, soft, warm, surrounded by the scent of pine and the laughter of children. Later, the celebration flowed into dusk. Lanterns were strung from branches, casting soft glows over plates of fresh bread, wild berries, forest stew. Ellie performed a butterfly dance with two other girls. Mira's art students gifted her a giant canvas with a painting of her cabin, a garden blooming wildly around it. Kevin sat beside Mira on the old wooden swing beneath the tree, their fingers intertwined. "You know," he said, "this wasn't in any of my plans." Mira leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Good," she whispered. "The best things never are." A breeze rustled the leaves above them. In the quiet of twilight, surrounded by the people they had come to love, and who loved them in return, it felt like the entire forest sighed in contentment. And as the stars blinked awake, Mira looked up at the tree and smiled. "I once stayed because I was afraid to leave," she said softly. "Now, I stay because it's where my heart has chosen to belong." Kevin kissed her forehead. "Then let's keep building," he murmured. "Not cities," she grinned. "No," he said. "Homes, right here." And beneath the branches that had once sheltered silence, now echoed a promise. That family was not made by blood or blueprints, but by choosing each other again and again, where the heart decides to stay. If this story warmed your heart and reminded you that family is not always found where we expect, but often where our hearts feel most at peace, then you are exactly where you need to be. Thank you for joining us on Kevin, Mira, and Ellie's unforgettable journey, from silence to song, from solitude to home. Let their story be a gentle reminder. Sometimes, getting lost in the forest is how we find what we were truly looking for. If you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and stay with you long after they end, subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. More heartfelt tales are just one click away. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that just might change your day or your life. See you in the next story, where the soul meets its echo.